Hello, everyone, and welcome to our March Crane Research Forum. Thank you for joining us today. We're glad you're here. My name is Dr. Rebecca Dorr, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. During our event today, my colleague Kathy is going to be monitoring our chat box, and we'll be adding some housekeeping items there. These monthly forums feature research on emerging or key topics that really impact the field of early care and education. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Dana Miller-Cotto, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Delaware and an incoming assistant professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Kent State University. Dr. Miller-Cotto studies how cognitive development and contextual factors predict educational disparities for historically underserved students, including low-income, Black or Latinx, and students with learning disabilities, with the goal of designing learning interventions for students of all ability levels. Today, Dr. Miller-Cotto will share research demonstrating the relations between reading, math, and executive function skills in children from kindergarten to third grade. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Miller-Cotto.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Rebecca. I really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time. I'll be presenting on work that I've been doing for the past few years on executive function and academic outcomes. And I'll just give you a quick, FYI. So most of my research focuses on math outcomes. And so many of my examples will have to do with mathematics. So if you're not partial to math, I apologize in advance. So as a quick rundown of just what I'll be giving you today, I'll give you a summary of my research. And a couple of things I want to focus on are what can executive function and academic outcomes research tell us? I think sometimes, I know as myself as a researcher, sometimes I have a tendency to try to say more than what the research is actually demonstrating, but I actually want to pull back a little bit and kind of like take a pause and really just think about, okay, what is the research actually saying? And then what can't it tell us? What are some remaining questions and what are some things that we really need to think about as we think about how research can be translated to practice? And then finally, I want to think about promising directions for education, research, and practice, directions for my research, but also directions for actual practice and how this research may translate in the future once we have more answers. So what are executive functions? This is a really hot topic right now. And I think a lot of people have been using it. And so there's an agreed upon definition. There's a lot of different variations in that definition. So like we'll be talking about today, I just want to preface that by saying that this is how I'll be defining it, and this is how I'll be talking about it in my research. So we can really view executive functions as the air traffic control system of the mind. So you might imagine a person or a decision maker in your mind, kind of helping you control your thoughts and your behaviors and your emotions. So executive functions are in charge and kind of guide everything that we do. Our thoughts, our behaviors, our emotions. So as you're listening to this talk, your executive functions are guiding you to attend to me talking or to what I'm saying, what I'm directing your attention to. So perhaps maybe there's a car horn going off in the background where you are. Maybe there's a small child in the background who's babbling. I know my 11-month-old's out there babbling with his grandparents. And so really trying to attend and to pay attention to me, and for me to be paying attention to what I'm saying and my thoughts. That's all executive functions. Our executive functions are at work. So executive functions, they're really a broader umbrella, a term for some dimensions. It's a really broad umbrella term that houses 3 dimensions. And so these dimensions include inhibitory control, so our ability to ignore distractions and to pay attention. So you're using a lot of that right now as you're listening to me. Then we have working memory. Working memory is defined as our ability to hold information in mind and to manipulate it for later use. And then finally, we have cognitive flexibility. So this is defined as our ability to shift between tasks, goals, or strategies. And so these are a lot of words, right? But what does this really look like in the real world? So everyday examples of executive functions include a couple of things, right? So So, and I apologize for the text. It didn't translate well when I uploaded it to Google Slides. But the first one, if you can't see it, is shopping at the grocery store. So one example of this could look like, let's say you go to the grocery store and you know that you have $20 in cash in your pocket to spend. And that's the cap. That's as much as you can spend when you get to the store. And so as you're going through the store and putting items in your basket, you're paying attention to the item, how much the item costs, and you're also subtracting the cost of that item from the total of 20 and keeping track of how much money you have left over. So this is taking into account working memory and also your cognitive flexibility, right? And then that really is an example of a real world solving a math problem, right? So this is a real world problem. We're keeping track of the information, the total number or the total cash you have in your pocket, and also being able to keep track of how much money you have left. Another example, not related to math, is organizing your clothes by color and season. So spring is coming, right? And so many of us put our clothes away in bins or maybe boxes to transfer them from our dressers. And so you might decide that, first you want to organize by color and season. So first you decide, okay, we're going to start with the green clothes, but then maybe the green clothes have to be organized by season as well. This would be an example of cognitive flexibility. So as you're organizing, you also have to shift goals, tasks, or strategies during this organizing opportunity. And then I think one really great example of executive functions I like to use is driving. So imagine you're on the road and you have to pay attention to what's in front of you, what's on the sides of you, what's behind you, right? You're looking in your rear view mirror. But then you're also thinking, okay, well, how do I get from point A to point B? That might require you to change lanes at one point. And so you're flexibly shifting between your goals and strategies as you're driving. So there's a lot of executive function going on in driving. You might also be ignoring what's going on the radio because you want to get to where you want to go safely. So those are a couple of real world examples or everyday examples of using executive functions. And so related to academic outcomes, and a primary reason we're all here today, executive functions are associated with a broad range of academic outcomes. And so a couple of these might include reading and math skills. And that's where most of my research is focused, primarily in mathematics. And so the research suggests that executive functions are highly related to reading and math skills. They're correlated pretty strongly. They're also really strongly related to learning disabilities. So what we see is that children who demonstrate reading or math disabilities or difficulties also demonstrate poor performance on many executive function tasks. Similarly, we also see this with children with language difficulties. Children who have trouble with language also tend to demonstrate poor performance on executive function tasks. On the other end, some research suggests, although I know that there's this research is also inconclusive, but there's some research that suggests children who are bilingual also demonstrate some strength in executive function. Again, I don't want to make too much of that finding because there's a lot of contentious conversations around it. And then finally, another thing, no way an exhaustive list, but another area where executive functions are highly related are ADD and ADHD disorders, right? So children who are demonstrating some of may check off a lot of boxes for ADD and ADHD tend to also really struggle with executive function tasks when being assessed. And so we can take from this that individuals who perform well on executive function tasks tend to do really well in school, many aspects of school, not just from an academic standpoint, but also what might be considered very good regulatory behavior, sitting still, paying attention, all the things you might think of when you think of like a model, what we identify as a model student. So how do we know when an individual or a child has strong or weak executive function? So there's a number of ways that folks assess this. So two tasks that are often used in laboratory or research settings are the Stroop task and the numbers reverse task. Numbers reverse is also referred to as a reverse digit span or a backward digit span task. One thing I want to say though first before I continue is that it's important to remember these are just two assessments that people use. There's so many executive function assessments specific to each dimension among the three dimensions we mentioned, and some that are the more broad executive function assessments. And so this is no way an exhaustive list. And I chose these two tasks simply because they're easy to explain and they're easy to demonstrate, which I'll show you in one moment. And so the first task I'll show you is the Stroop task, which measures inhibitory control and cognitive flexibility. And let's see if this will let me play it. Whoops, excuse me. Oh, it's not gonna let me play. Okay, one moment. I will play this for you. Excuse me. Thank you for your patience. Sorry about that. I'm about to play it. One moment.
Do you own your home, but still rent your electricity? If you pay more than $50 a month in electricity, then you might.
Can you all see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Thank you.
You could try to go to full screen too.
Oh, thanks.
Here we go.
Okay, so a couple things about the Stroop task, right? So one thing we've noticed when we pay attention to that task is that task is really asking us to sometimes ignore the color and say the word. And so this is really what we're defining as being able to inhibit, right, our desire to actually pay attention to the color rather than the word. On the other end, we might have a situation where in the middle of the task, they switch the rule on us. So they may say, okay, first we were asked to pay attention to saying the word, and now they're asking us to say the color and ignore the word. So in the middle of that would be described as cognitive flexibility and inhibitory control. So switching and inhibiting our desire to actually say what we want to say instead of what the task is actually asking us to do. So because of the limitations of the YouTube video, I'll just describe this one instead of playing the video. And it's this one's very straightforward. So the numbers reverse task, usually we have a child sit in front of us and we might say, okay, I'm going to offer you a string of numbers. And for the first iteration of the task, we'll usually just assess short-term memory to see if they get the rules. So if I say the string of numbers is 215, we ask the child to say that, they'll say 215. Now, during another iteration, we'll start the numbers reverse task, and we'll say, if I say, I'm going to give you a string of numbers and you're going to say them in the reverse or backwards order. So let's try. So if I say 215, they would say 512. And we would continue that process, and the string of numbers would continue to increase by 1 until the child demonstrates 4 consecutive errors, and then the task would stop. And so since this won't play, I will let you all, on your own leisure, find this and to watch it yourself. Oh, my 11-month-old's not too happy about lunch. Okay, and so with the numbers reverse task, we're asking people to be successful at this task. We're really asking them to remember the numbers and then to manipulate them in another order, right? So if we're saying, okay, string of numbers 413, they have to repeat the numbers to themselves if they want to be successful at it, but then think about, okay, what does that look like in the opposite direction? Some people are very good at this, while many people struggle with it, right? And so what does this look like in a classroom? And you might ask yourself, how are executive functions at work with my students, with children that I know? What does this look like? What do executive function challenges usually look like? Sometimes when children are demonstrating challenges with it, we might notice a couple of things or behaviors. So they may struggle to plan or organize for long-term goals. When we say long-term goals, we don't mean like planning a vacation, but we might think of this as, they have a project to complete and really struggling to sit down and map out how to get from start to finish with that project, or backward planning. They also might demonstrate some difficulty controlling their behaviors or their emotions, right? So this is often termed poor emotion regulation. They also might have a hard time concentrating on a specific task. And I want to differentiate this between, normal childlike behaviors where, sometimes they may have a hard time sitting still, or we might have a child who sits still for a few minutes and then gets up. So we want to differentiate between those behaviors. They also might think about children who have a really hard time remembering details. So sometimes, if anyone who's worked in a preschool classroom, sometimes you might give children directions and say, okay, when we sit down at our desks, we're going to take out our blue notebooks and we're going to take out a sharp pencil and our crayons, and we're going to start a project. So that's about 3 steps, right? Some children might struggle to remember all the details of those steps. And so we want to think about what are the best ways to present those details, especially for children who are struggling. And like I said, because I study math, I'm going to also offer a couple of math examples. So executive functions in a math classroom might look a little different, right? So when we talk about being able to hold information in mind and use it, and to use it in some way, an older example, not necessarily with young children, might be like when doing algebra. We're holding in mind which steps you did on one side of the equation and the answer that you might have gotten, so that you can balance it on the other side of the equation. Sometimes we see this with students who do a lot of steps in their heads. And so they might decide not to write down everything. So they have to keep that information in mind. Then in terms of cognitive flexibility, again, being able to flexibly use different strategies, being able to switch back and forth quickly and easily between solving multiplication and subtraction problems, especially if this is an equation that requires a PEMDAS or a strategy of using multiple operations. And then finally, for inhibitory control, again, focusing attention and ignoring distractions. So we might see this pop up in a math classroom, especially in word problems that tend to have a lot of details. And we're asking children to ignore irrelevant details when solving word problems. So sometimes my favorite example of this is when children are solving a problem, let's say with cupcakes, and they are saying, okay, well, this class collected 19 blue cupcakes and 14 purple cupcakes and 17 red cupcakes. And this class collected similar numbers, and they ask, you get to the end of the problem, it's like, how many red cupcakes were collected? And so there's a lot of unnecessary details, but it's also making sure that children understand what they're being asked to do, and to pay attention and to ignore the irrelevant details of the problem. Excuse me, sorry about that. So what a lot of my research is focused on this overarching question of like, well, okay, we see that executive functions and academic outcomes, particularly math skills, are so related. And with this finding keeps popping up, right? I think that some of us who study executive functions as it relates to other outcomes, a lot of times we're seeing this highly correlated with so many outcomes, and it comes up as a finding very regularly, but there aren't a lot of details often as to why they might be related, and furthermore, testing why they might be related. And so some of my work has looked at testing theories of executive function and math ability. And so in one project, we examined 3 theories of, particularly, we focused on working memory and math and reading skills. And so we were interested, in layman's terms, we were interested, and I'll talk a little bit more about the technical research or the theoretical perspectives in a moment. We were interested in 3 perspectives of these relationships. So first, are working memory and these skills the same? So one perspective of these relationships suggests that potentially working memory and academic outcomes, whether it's reading or math skills, they're related because they're getting at something similar, some underlying skill that are shared between these 2 constructs or these variables. And so some people might say that's intelligence, it could be something else. But they share something. They share this underlying common factor, and that's why we're seeing these strong relationships. So that's one perspective. The second perspective is, does working memory help take information from your mind? So does it act like a processor in some way, right? So that's one perspective. It's suggesting that working memory is kind of acting as like this kind of ushering information to the top of mind for what you need when you're reading or when you're engaging in a math lesson or a math problem. And finally, the third perspective is, does working memory really act like a filter? So is it filtering information, suggesting that, okay, we have all this information around us, and working memory is kind of acting like this bottleneck of just like, okay, here's the relevant information, let's get rid of the rest of it. So those are 3 perspectives or theories of executive function, or working memory and math that we really wanted to examine. So from a technical level, in the literature, we define these collection of theories or perspectives in 3 different ways. And I apologize in advance, this is in a separate order from what I just presented, but we have these 3 perspectives. And so the first we really define as the cognitive filter, right? So suggesting that, with working memory, the way it works is that it is filtering information. So what we see here is that we have math during kindergarten, filtering information, information is being filtered through working memory to predict math during first grade, filtered again at first grade through working memory to predict math in second grade. The second perspective is we call the positive manifold. And so this was the one that suggests that perhaps math and working memory are related because there's this shared underlying common factor between math and working memory. And we don't know what it is yet, but we would expect them to be highly related if they are sharing this underlying factor, whatever it is. And so finally, the third subset of theories or perspectives that we sought to test was what we call the transactional subset, or the transactional model of theories. And so this is suggesting that the reason that math and working memory are so highly related is because really they're kind of, they work in a reciprocal manner. And so this suggests, or this subset of theories also suggests, that the reason math and working memory are so highly related is because math and working memory aren't just, or working memory isn't just our ability to pull information from our prior knowledge or our long-term memory and to bring it to top of mind, but it's also our ability to manipulate information. So not just the basic definition of manipulating information, but also this ability to pull information from prior knowledge and to become top of mind. And so because of the way these relationships were set up, we tested these theories using path analyses, a statistical test. And so to do this, we took a nationally representative sample. So if anybody's familiar with this data set, we used the early childhood longitudinal study kindergarten cohort, the 2011 cohort, to look at these variables, the relationships between these variables. And so we tested these three models, and like I said, this was a nationally representative sample, so it was relatively diverse relative to many other data sets. And to do this, we also used it was over 13,000 children in the entire data set. So what we found was that after doing our path analyses, what we found is that there was confirmation or support for this reciprocal relationship, what we term the transactional relationship. What we also found was that relations decreased with age. So when we're looking from kindergarten to first grade to second grade, we saw that the relationships from math in kindergarten to first grade and first grade to second grade decreased. Relationships between math and working memory decreased with age. And so this may suggest that what's happening is that children are relying less on working memory as they get older, and perhaps they're relying more on their prior knowledge as they get older. For this project, we also decided to replicate it with a slightly older sample. So what we did was we went from instead of going from kindergarten to first grade to second grade, we went from kindergarten all the way up to fifth grade. We also examined this using instead of just working memory, we also looked at whether we saw the same relations with the cognitive filter or cognitive flexibility, and we saw similar relations. So again, we saw a reciprocal relationship happening. We also saw that the relations between math and working memory and math, decreased with age. Again, this may suggest that children reliance on their executive function potentially decreases, potentially because they're relying less on their executive functions, but also it could mean that the types of math that's requiring executive function changes as kids get older. Of course, this awaits further confirmation from future research. And so what now? What do we take from this information? It goes back to my initial question of what can the research tell us and what doesn't it tell us? So for now, it tells us that potentially working memory is helping in some way pull information from memory. Of course, this may require some experimental manipulation to really make some firm confirmation or some firm conclusions about whether that's truly the case. And so this also might suggest, some people may say, okay, well, if there's such a reliance on working memory when children are younger, maybe what we should be doing is building working memory. We should focus on learning to train their working memory so that it can improve this ability to pull information from prior knowledge or from longer term memory. Unfortunately, not particularly pertaining to my research, but some of my research suggests that executive function training has demonstrated limited results. There has been only very few studies that have shown that when focusing on trying to build executive functions, there's a transfer to a build or improvement in math or reading outcomes. And so this might suggest that should we be focusing on training or should we be focusing on other things? Up to this point, what I've done with my research is I focus on other things. And what these other things mean is less focus on training and maybe more focus on finding ways to support executive functions as opposed to building executive functions. And so some of the ways that we have attempted to support executive functions is through So worked examples research. So whoever, or for anyone who's not familiar with worked examples, what we usually see, many of us who have ever taken a math class, many math textbooks, often children are presented with just the problem and asked to solve the problem. And so worked examples kind of pushes away or pushes on that, challenges that idea a little bit. And some of the work that we've done, what we do is we present a student with a fictitious student. So in this instance, and I apologize, it's a little blurry, Denise solved this problem correctly. Here's her work. And so Denise may see this problem here, and then she writes out all of her problem. And so the child who is studying this fictitious student, Denise, is getting to see not only the problem, but also all the steps that Denise took to solve the problem. And then they're given the opportunity to solve the problem on their own. Prior work suggests that when textbooks are replaced or worksheets are replaced with half the problems are replaced with a worked example, students tend to do much better on different academic or math achievement tests relative to kids who are only exposed to the problem and no worked example. This is particularly the case when with children with lower prior knowledge. This helps children who really struggle in math. And so one might say, well, there's a bunch of reasons why this might be related to executive functions. We'll return to that point in a moment. So more specific to the work that I've done more recently, this isn't, okay. So what I've done mostly more recently and related to this is looked at what's called faded worked examples. So in the prior example, we saw a fully worked example and an opportunity to solve the problem. So that was an example paired with a problem. In this example, or what we've done with faded worked examples, when presented with a faded worked example, what one might see is they would be first presented with a fully worked example. So this isn't just the problem 534 times 56. You get all of the steps needed to solve the problem. And then perhaps during the second time they see it, or the third, depending on the rate in which they're being presented these problems, the next time they see it, instead of the answer, being given the answer, they're given with all the steps to solve the problem, but not the answer. Next time they see it, most of the steps, but then maybe 2 steps are left off, the answer and the last step. Next time they see it, 3 steps are left off in addition to the answer. And then this continues until eventually it's just the problem. So the way I like to see this one is a worked example with training wheels. And so in one example or one study, what we've done is we want to know, does presenting too much of a problem at once overwhelm students, right? And so really it's just saying, okay, is there a benefit to kind of fading out these steps instead of giving them fully worked examples all the time to study? We started this work with much older, so we started this with college students who were in a remedial math class. And what they were presented with was faded worked examples with a self-explanation, so a prompt of just like, why did you solve the problem this way? Or to elaborate on their choices in solving. The third group was presented with a self-explanation. And then finally, there was like a business as usual group. So they were just presented with problems. And what we found was that students with lower prior knowledge benefited mostly from the faded worked examples condition. So the faded worked examples group would outperform the other groups. These are 4 different groups, and students were assigned to each of these groups. The group that was presented with faded worked examples benefited or demonstrated the greatest benefit. So in line with this idea of executive functions, or how does problem presentation, how can it benefit, or how can executive functions benefit from problem presentation? We wanted to know, well, how does working memory and inhibitory control fit into this? Is there any benefit to presenting these problems differently for students who demonstrate challenges with executive functions? And so for the follow-up study, we worked with much younger children, worked with 4th graders. Children were given, were assigned to 4 different groups. So there was a faded worked example group, activated worked examples with self-explanation prompts, worked examples, and business as usual. So this design was slightly different from the prior example. We assessed their inhibitory control and their working memory. So we used the children's adaptation of the Stroop task, a much younger task, adapted for third graders. And then we use a numbers reverse task. So simply just presenting the string of numbers and asking them to repeat them in the reverse order. And what we found was that children who demonstrated weak working memory, but average prior knowledge, so they weren't weak on prior math, in this case, arithmetic, but they were pretty much average. They benefited the most from the worked examples. And so what does this all mean? We're putting this all together. What can we take away from this? So executive functions appear to affect how much students benefit from problem presentation in mathematics. And again, some people may argue, well, really, instead of changing the problems, what we should be doing is training the executive functions. Well, we'd go back to our original point. Unfortunately, there's little evidence that training these executive function skills transfers to academic outcomes. What we mean when we say that is oftentimes people are assuming that we train the executive function skill and then we'll see improvements in math or reading. And so we don't see any evidence of that yet. That's not to say it's impossible, just we don't see any evidence of it yet. And so what can we take from this? So a couple of things, and I want to revisit the theories that I've set out to test in my prior work. So again, in my prior work, I've set out to test these 3 theories of the cognitive filter to really get a sense of, okay, if we're not training them, then what's really explaining these relationships? If the support for the prior work was with the transactional model, assuming that there's this reciprocal relationship, then one could also say that maybe improving working memory means improving math, and improving math means improving working memory. But we haven't seen that from training activities, right? So in essence, even though there's support from the analyses suggesting that the transactional model, there was support from the data, we don't see that in these actual training studies. So what if none of these, or maybe only part of these, are accurate, right? So what if it's a combination of the 2 of these and this one is actually inaccurate? So I want to offer an alternative perspective that I intend to work through in my future research and currently working on right now. And so what if there's something about children who do well on executive function tasks that also do well on academic tasks? And so this is similar to the positive manifold in the sense that there's a belief that there might be some underlying factor with working memory in particular and academic tasks or academic outcomes. So this idea that if you do well on one, you're doing well on the other, but there's some reason why you're able to do well on both. Some people have suggested, well, maybe it's just intelligence. Maybe that's the underlying factor. But prior work has already ruled this out and said that intelligence is really something of its own. And it really shouldn't be included in these arguments. And so something that I've been thinking about, my colleagues have been working through, is what if this underlying factor, this underlying thing about children who do well on these tasks and these academic tasks are really strategies? In other words, perhaps children who do well on a working memory task and who also do well in academic tasks or academic skills are really good at thinking about a strategy. So these are children who may come up with a strategy very quickly when confronted with a challenge or a task. And so the children who are coming up with these strategies is really what's explaining the relationship between working memory and academic skills, and similarly to other aspects of executive functioning. And so while this is very interesting to me, and perhaps interesting to some of you, one thing I would say at this point would be, what can we do with this, right? And I want to redirect our attention to what can we do to advocate for our children in the absence of maybe firm findings or firm conclusions. So a couple of things to remember. There's a lot of research around supporting executive functions, right? And I think that there's a lot of more confirmation about the support of executive functions, but less about building executive functions. And so that awaits further confirmation. And I'm hopeful that we might see some of that in future years, especially with recent initiatives to train executive functions. But I would also offer suggestion that altering presentation might be one way to focus our efforts. As we've seen a lot of evidence that this is actually helpful for children, not just in my research, but in other research as well. And so this might also look like, when we're supporting executive functions, giving directions, potentially in fewer steps, taking time, going a little slower for children so that they can hear and understand what we're saying. Other things to remember are that executive function practices or strategies that work in math may not work in reading, right? Because these may be specific strategies that may not work. Of course, maybe my future work may suggest that if one strategy works, maybe children will pick up and use them for other things. Of course, that also awaits further confirmation. And so many of these practicing or building that we see in these training studies, if it works in reading, it won't necessarily work in math. Again, this is something that still waits further confirmation. And so what I hope is what we can learn from this work is that there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of answers, but there's still a lot of questions. And I think it still is very premature to make any firm recommendations on what this means for practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. So as Kathy has been noting in the chat box, we now have some time for question and answers. So please submit questions using that Q&A feature, and I will relay them over for Dr. Miller-Cotto to answer. I can get us started with one question of my own that came to me while you were speaking. Can you talk some more about why you think training executive function isn't working? And is it working to improve executive function skills, but not transferring? Or is it just not working to improve skills at all? And why might that be the case?
That's a wonderful question. That's something I wanted to talk about, but I didn't think I would have enough time. So I'm glad you asked. So I think one reason that we haven't really seen any, so I guess to back up a little bit, what we have seen with a lot of training studies, a lot of times folks will have children engage in an executive function task with the hope that it will transfer to a math task, right? And so we haven't really seen a lot of evidence of that happening. And I think that one reason for that, and I think the reason I'm getting this answer from work that has seen transfer, is that a lot of times executive function tasks are not embedded in a domain specific task. And so a lot of people view executive function as domain general. And so when they're training, a lot of the studies are training executive functions, they stick with this domain general training. But when we actually do see transfer, and there's one really great paper that I can write in the chat when I'm finished. When we do see transfer, it's often an executive function task that has been kind of created for domain specific. So when I say domain specific, if it's an executive function task, a reading executive function task. So it requires reading, but it also requires an executive function component. And so we do see transfer in those instances. And so what I think this is kind of telling us is that executive functions have to be potentially more ecological, like the tasks we're using might need to be more ecologically valid. They really should be embedded in a specific goal or a specific domain for it to be successful.
Yeah, great, thank you. We have one question from Karen Hoyt. How do you explain strategy as different from working memory? Do you need working memory to use strategy?
That's a great question. And I think that's something that we have talked about a little bit, at least my colleagues and I, Pong Pong from UT Austin. And we're thinking that the thing about working memory is that it is helping children like decide a strategy. But some of that, we don't know how much of that is tied up in, I'm so sorry, in terms of prior knowledge, right? So some of the strategy comes from just simple experience, right? Of being able to figure, well, I've kind of building schemas. I've seen this thing before, and this thing reminds me of this other thing. So therefore, I'm going to use a strategy of the thing I've seen before, right? And so some of that might be what working memory is doing. Is working memory is kind of like pulling that information to say, okay, here's the cue, or here's what you remember. Here's how I can bring it to top of mind. And so I think that strategy might be different from working memory. Is just like the strategy exists in your prior knowledge, but the working memory is kind of what's helping you remember or to pull it to top of mind.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. I had a related question, building off of that strategy idea. So if your hypothesis is right, that strategy is really what's going on there, right? Like, how is there a way that we can support strategy building, and what might that look like?
So I think that actually might look more like the few successful executive function trainings we've seen. And so this kind of flips a little bit of what executive function, we've defined it. We've defined it very much as being domain general, but I almost wonder if executive function kind of sits in between the domain general and the domain specific. And so maybe strategy building might look more like, if we're building a strategy to do better at the executive functions, then it really should be a strategy that also maps onto what we'd be doing with reading or math. I think that's how that might work. Like, again, like these are very preliminary ideas, and these are only exist in my mind right now.
Sure. Yeah, but that makes sense. So it's really saying that strategy building is something that we need to, it needs to be specific to the academic domain that we want kids to transfer it to.
Absolutely. I think there's been a big conversation and a big push around, at least in my circles, for executive function tasks to be more ecologically valid for that reason. Yeah, that
makes sense. And then I know, a lot of your studies are with slightly older kids than some of our audience might be typically working with. Can you talk about whether worked examples or altering presentation in other ways would work all the way down to like kindergarten or pre-K? And if so, like, what does that look like for that younger population?
Sure. So we actually have done similar work with middle schoolers. I think these were 6th graders. So we were really interested in trying to test this idea that, okay, maybe your ability or the relationships between working memory and math is not just the ability to pull information, but maybe it's even like offloading, like a type of offloading. So if you are really good at working memory and or your academic skills, maybe it's your ability to say, okay, how do I put some of this information that I need to solve the problem away for a second so I can deal with these other things happening? And so a strategy that we've talked about for middle schoolers that we actually tested was sketching. So as you're solving a math problem or a science problem, sometimes maybe writing down the details is helpful, but also maybe trying to sketch the details out have been really helpful, because not only are you able to like offload that information to use it again, and just like a physical reminder of here's the information that you're going to need to get to the end of the problem, but it's also being able to map or represent these relationships between components of the problem. That's been one strategy that we've seen that has been really effective. I think I will say the struggle with it though is children are not, or students are not used to drawing. They're not used to sketching. Like you ask them to sketch in a class and like, what? This sounds silly. Whereas as opposed to maybe self-explanation where they are used to justifying their answer. Sketching is something that's kind of new, and I think sometimes uncomfortable for some kids. I think as an anecdote, we had tried this with 6th graders, and some kids came in and said, oh, I do this in my class all the time. This is easy. And other kids were like, I don't really know about this. I don't know how I'm going to use sketching to solve the problem. But we did see some confirmation that it does help them offload, or maybe just kind of use parking lot their information on a piece of paper so they can work through the problems.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I wonder if for like pre-K, kindergarten, like all the way down to early childhood, if they would be more comfortable with sketching because they're drawing.
They're drawing anyway.
It's preschool, right?
Yeah.
And so if we could build up those strategies for simple addition problems or whatever the kids are doing in kindergarten, maybe they would be more used to it by the time they get to more advanced math where it would be beneficial.
Totally, exactly.
That's really interesting. We have a question that came in from Meredith Hunt. As a layperson, how are the strategies you discussed, such as the worked problem, different from actual explicit instruction, especially for younger children? As a parent, there seems to be either A, little actual explicit instruction in our public school setting, particularly in reading, or B, an over instruction of strategy without sufficiently ensuring children are proficient with using any one strategy, and that's in math particularly.
That's a phenomenal question. I actually talked to a really good friend of mine who was a 3rd grade math teacher for 20 years, who was recently stepped away from the classroom, and the conversation that we had. So I apologize in advance if this isn't a total answer to your question, but something we've thought about. And I think like talking through these ideas with a third grade math teacher who's been in the classroom for 30 years, this idea of strategy. And the thing that she said to me was, what I'm getting from this is it's not about like specific to executive function. It's not like specific to anything. It's really what it's specific to is just really good instruction, really good explicit instruction and opportunities to practice. And so I think some of that is, yeah, to your point, it may just really be just devising some really clear instructional practices and strategies that give kids an opportunity to kind of build schemas or to build their experience around seeing similar problems. I think that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. We have another question back to referring to the discussion about sketching. She asks, is this related at all to doodling that many children with ADHD are known to do in workbooks? And can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, the work that I've seen and the work that I've seen other people relate this to is some of that. So a really good friend of mine, a school psychologist, and she talks about this a little bit in some of her work, suggesting that, they do have children who have ADHD challenges often doodle with the intention of kind of like giving them a way to center their information and also again like parking lot some of their thoughts. And so this is what this question reminds me of, is just this is a strategy for children who may not necessarily have ADHD, but who are struggling with attention challenges, another opportunity for them to be able to kind of put their thoughts somewhere so that they can attend to it later.
Right. That makes sense. Great. We have another question from Michelle. Do we assume that working memory deficits and executive functioning is the same for everyone? So we hope to unlock strategies that apply for all, or hope to unlock ways of figuring out if there are different pathways the working memory challenges are exhibited? Do we assume at this time there is root to the strategies that working memory challenges are not unique to individual, but circumstance or domain?
I love this question. So I would say that and there was a slide I had here and I took it out because I said it was too much and I didn't know how to tie it in with the rest. So one thing I will say is, so working from what I know and what I've seen, we can comfortably say that executive functions are contextually specific and domain specific. If you perform well in an executive function task in a quiet environment, there's no guarantee you will do well on it again in another environment, right? And I think that some of the issue with some of the research, that existing research, is that you assess executive function at time 1 and use it to predict all these things at time 2, not thinking that maybe there was something that happened at time 2 that you didn't capture in time 1 because you only assessed executive function once. So I would say that I think that, and I apologize if I missed part of this question. I think that the thing with executive functions that we can say for sure is that it is context specific. We see some of that in the stereotype threat literature. And that literature suggests that if you are aware of a stereotype, or you are aware of confirming that you as a person, as a woman, as a person of color, or anything, if you're aware of confirming a stereotype or have the fear of confirming a stereotype, you will see a detriment in your working memory and also your performance on a specific task. And so I think that, to the earlier part of your question, is like, well, do people suffer from working memory challenges in the same way? I would say no. I would say maybe working memory might be work in similar ways, but then the context adds a whole other layer of chaos to all of this that makes it really hard to understand specifics. And I think that's it speaks to part of why this work is so complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me wonder whether there are if there are individual differences and population level differences in what these look like. Are there differences in how we are there more targeted interventions or more targeted supports that we should be providing to different students on that basis?
Absolutely. And even so we have some work now suggesting, are the way that we assess executive functions, should they be the same across groups? Mm-hmm. And we don't know the answer to that yet, but I think that's something to consider too.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I think we are running out of time here and wrapping up. Dr. Miller-Cotto, do you have any other final points you want to make or takeaways for this group?
I think the questions were so great that I don't have anything else to add.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for all our attendees for joining us. When you do leave the meeting today, a very short survey will pop up. Please fill that out if you're able to. We really do value your feedback and use it to inform future events. Thank you again for being here, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.